Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today, we're diving deep into a text that really forces you to question the whole logic of state power, especially its relationship to global risk. The book is Hegemony or Survival: America's Quest for Global Dominance by Noam Chomsky.
It's definitely more than just a foreign policy book. It's really an analysis of institutional priorities, right?
Exactly. And the core mission of this deep dive is to tackle this fundamental and pretty existential question that Chomsky poses.
Which is, what is the relationship between one powerful state pursuing permanent global dominance, what we call hegemony, and the systemic threats facing all of humanity?
That framing is so intense, it's designed to pull this whole idea of political strategy out of, your typical debate and put it right into the context of survival. And he anchors this right at the start by referencing the biologist Ernst Mayr.
Yeah, Mayr, a giant in contemporary biology. He estimated that since life began, there have been maybe 50 billion species.
50 billion.
Right. And of all of those, only us, humans, achieved the kind of intellectual capacity to build a civilization. And that was only about 100,000 years ago.
And that timeline becomes so much more sobering when you hear Mayr's other observation.
Yeah.
The one about species longevity.
Indeed. Mayr added this pretty somber, scientifically backed fact that the average life expectancy of a species is about 100,000 years.
Which is exactly how long we've been around.
Precisely. And that provides the very dark context for Chomsky's main question.
Huh.
Are humans proving to be a kind of biological error? Are we using our allotted time just to destroy ourselves and, take much of life on Earth with us?
When you look at foreign policy or economic decisions through that lens, that 100,000-year clock, it's not about winning an election or controlling an oil field anymore.
Yeah.
We're looking at actions that collectively show this capacity for self-sabotage, prioritizing short-term power over the long-term survival of the entire species.
And that's the crucial shift in perspective this book demands. So, for this deep dive, we're going to be doing a systems-level analysis. We're not focused on whether individual leaders are good or bad people.
Right. It's not about intentions.
It's about the enduring institutional logic, the prevailing ideology, and the historical patterns that drive state behavior. The goal is to understand how a system designed for dominance can, with its own cold rationality, lead to outcomes that put power over survival.
Okay, so let's start unpacking that institutional logic, beginning with the source itself. To really grapple with this critique, we have to start with the person making the argument. Noam Chomsky.
Yeah.
Most people probably know him as a professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT.
Yeah, he's credited with, fundamentally revolutionizing modern linguistics.
But for decades, alongside that career, he's been just as famous for his political work.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Numerous best-selling books on empire, power structures, U.S. foreign policy. This goes all the way back to the 1960s. His work is just defined by this meticulous documentation and a focus on the consistency of how institutions behave, no matter who is in charge.
And this specific book, Hegemony or Survival, it lands at such a pivotal moment. It was published in 2003 with an afterword in 2004. So it's responding to these massive geopolitical shifts happening at the time.
You've got two huge contextual factors there. First, the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91. That removed the only major military rival to the U.S.
Leaving the U.S. as the sole superpower.
The sole superpower. And then second, you have the immediate trauma of the September 11th attacks, which created this profound psychological shift in the U.S. and provided a new urgent justification for very aggressive global power projection.
And this is where the analysis gets super specific. The trigger for the book wasn't just a general mood, it was a concrete document. The September 2002 National Security Strategy, or NSS.
That's right.
What does that document formalize that hadn't been said so openly before?
The 2002 NSS was, it was breathtaking in its language. It officially declared the right of the United States to use force to eliminate any perceived challenge to what it explicitly called U.S. global hegemony.
And not just for a little while.
No, the document asserted this was to be permanent. It essentially established a doctrine of unilateral, perpetual global dominance backed by military force against any potential rival.
That's not subtle policy language. That's a formal declaration of an imperial grand strategy.
It was. The goal was to maintain a unipolar world with no peer competitor. One international affairs specialist, John Eikenberry, said this new doctrine rendered the international norms of self-defense, the ones in the UN Charter, almost meaningless.
because it claimed a right for the U.S. that it would never ever tolerate for any other nation.
Exactly. So the central thesis of the book just crystallizes right there in the title. It's framing the world's choice. U.S. hegemony, this quest for permanent military-backed dominance or possibly human survival.
And the argument is that the quest itself is what's accelerating the threats.
That's the core of it. Chomsky argues that the search for this unquestioned power is the engine speeding up the danger of nuclear war and environmental destruction. And here's the systemic insight. The decisions driving this aren't necessarily made by madmen.
Right, they're rational.
They are rational, but only within the framework of prevailing ideology and the institutions that embody it. The system, as it's built, prioritizes short-term power over long-term survival.
It's a terrifying kind of rational self-interest, but self-interest defined by a very narrow, powerful group.
So let's lock down this definition of hegemony in the geopolitical sense. It's clearly more than just being the strongest kid on the block.
Oh, much more. It's a structural commitment to maintaining that status permanently.
A structural commitment.
Yes. Chomsky defines it as a grand strategy that's dedicated to making sure the U.S. military is strong enough to dissuade potential adversaries from pursuing a military buildup. The goal is to make sure no one can even hope to surpass or equal U.S. power.
And internally, in Washington, that's framed as necessary for global stability. Of course. But the sources in the book suggest the practical outcome is the exact opposite. It's fundamentally destabilizing. If you declare your dominance is permanent and will be enforced with a gun, well, how does the rest of the world react?
They don't just accept it.
No, the response is almost universally negative, even among allies. The U.S. presents itself as this benevolent global leader, but the effect, as analysts like Eichenberry describe it, is that the U.S. comes across as a revisionist state.
A revisionist state, meaning a state trying to tear up the old rules for its own benefit.
Exactly, and that automatically pushes everyone else, including your friends, to organize, to work around, undermine, contain, and retaliate against U.S. power.
So the strategy is kind of self-defeating in the long run.
It breeds resistance, not security. The prediction from these analysts was that the policy would leave the world more dangerous and divided, and the United States less secure. It's the complete opposite of the stated goal.
Which brings us to the military doctrine used to enforce all this preventive war. And we have to be really clear about the distinction between this and preemptive war.
Yes, the difference is everything. A preemptive war might be justifiable under international law, but only in the narrowest of circumstances.
Like what? An attack that's already on its way?
Exactly. Like enemy bombers are literally in the air minutes from your border. An attack is imminent and detectable. You could argue that's self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter.
But the NSS declared the right to wage preventive war. What's the fundamental difference, and why does Chomsky's analysis categorize it as a war crime?
Preventive war is using military force to eliminate a potential future challenge, a threat that is, imagined or invented. It's not a response to an imminent attack. The logic is, because you might threaten me one day, I have the right to attack you now.
That seems like a claim of almost unlimited authority. It just upends the whole post-World War II legal structure.
It does. The historian Arthur Schlesinger wrote that this policy was alarmingly similar to what Imperial Japan did at Pearl Harbor. He even said, chillingly, "It is we Americans who live in infamy."
And the legal scholars compared it to Nuremberg.
They did. Richard Falk argued it was inescapable that the Iraq War, justified this way, was a crime against peace, the very thing German leaders were prosecuted for at Nuremberg.
That comparison just drives home the gravity of what was being attempted. It's a declaration that the new norm is arbitrary force, not law.
And it gets worse. After WMDs weren't found in Iraq, the justification had to be refined. The official stance shifted.
From needing an actual threat to what?
To acting against a regime that has nothing more than the intent and ability to develop WMDs at some point in the future.
So the bar for war was just dropped to the floor. All you need is potential capability and someone to say you have bad intentions.
Precisely. And since almost any country has the potential to develop some kind of threat, and intent is in the eye of the beholder, it effectively grants Washington the right of arbitrary aggression against anyone.
So a strategy of perpetual dominance and arbitrary aggression. That's a tough sell. It would be impossible to sustain that domestically without a really powerful, self-justifying ideology.
And Chomsky traces this back to what's often called the Wilsonian tradition.
Okay, what's the core belief there?
The foundational belief, which just permeates the U.S. policy elite, is that we, the U.S. leadership, are inherently good, even noble, that were driven by elevated ideals and dedicated to stability and righteousness.
So this creates the idea of America as historical vanguard, the nation that's uniquely positioned to understand and fulfill history's ultimate purpose.
And because of that special role, the U.S. isn't just allowed, it's obligated to act as its leaders see fit for the good of everyone, whether other people agree or not.
To maintain that kind of self-image, you have to ignore a lot of inconvenient history.
You need what critics have called intentional ignorance. It's a psychological and political tool you need to tidy up the past and keep the narrative of a noble phase in foreign policy intact.
What does that look like in practice?
It means you systematically overlook or minimize atrocities that were backed by the U.S. For example, the terror campaigns in Central America in the 1980s. U.S.-trained and equipped forces maintained control through, widespread slaughter and torture.
For the support for Saddam Hussein.
Exactly. The U.S. supported Saddam well past his worst crimes because he was a useful counterweight to Iran. That knowledge, the fact that we provided arms, intelligence, diplomatic cover, it has to be scrubbed from the mainstream story for the noble vanguard idea to work.
So you can't admit those facts without challenging the core premise that the U.S. only acts for freedom and democracy.
Right. It's a major achievement of doctrinal systems, as Chomsky points out, that they can tell you all about Saddam's worst offenses while successfully suppressing the crucial detail with our help.
So declaring this grand strategy in the NS wasn't enough on its own. It had to be put into practice to become a new norm.
That's how great powers work. You have to establish a new policy as a norm of international law through exemplary actions. You have to show without a doubt that you're willing to ignore the law and face no real consequences.
And Iraq was the perfect test case. The petri dish, as the book puts it.
It was. The target had to meet very specific criteria.
What were they?
It had to be basically defenseless, unlike, say, North Korea. It had to be strategically important, oil.
Yeah.
And it had to be easily portrayed to the public as pure evil and an imminent threat. Iraq checked all those boxes.
And the defenselessness was actually the most important part.
It seems so. It minimized the risk to the hegemon. And this whole process reveals a deep hypocrisy when you compare so-called humanitarian interventions.
How so?
Well, just compare the Western-hailed interventions of the 1990s, like Kosovo, with two interventions in the 1970s that actually stopped mass slaughter. India's intervention in East Pakistan and Vietnam's intervention in Cambodia, which ended Pol Pot's regime.
So you're saying the West didn't actually stop a genocide in the 90s, but those other two countries did in the 70s, and we never hear about it.
Not only do we not hear about them, the U.S. actively opposed and punished India and Vietnam for stopping those massacres. In Vietnam's case, the U.S. even started supporting the ousted Khmer Rouge.
Because the interventions were carried out by the wrong people.
Exactly. It completely invalidates the idea that only the U.S. has the moral authority to intervene. It highlights what the International Court of Justice warned about back in 1949, that any so-called right of intervention would be reserved for the most powerful states.
So despite this commitment from the leadership to establish new norms, the push for the Iraq War revealed this huge gap between the U.S. government and, well, the rest of the world.
It was a fascinating moment. Global polls before the invasion showed this extreme, widespread concern about the unbridled use of American power. By late 2002, support for Washington's war plans was barely at 10% almost anywhere outside the U.S. and Israel.
That level of unified opposition is incredible. It's what led to that observation that there might be two superpowers on the planet.
Yes. The United States, with its concentrated state power, and world public opinion.
And from Washington's perspective, that's a huge problem, a crisis of democracy.
And it was met not with accommodation, but with open contempt for democracy. The most obvious sign was that distinction they created between Old Europe and New Europe.
Walk us through that. It wasn't about geography, was it?
Not at all. A country was labeled Old Europe and basically scorned if its government took the same position as the vast majority of its own people and refused to follow U.S. orders.
And New Europe.
New Europe were the governments that joined the coalition of the willing, even if their populations were overwhelmingly against it. It was a pure litmus test for obedience.
The example of Turkey is a powerful one here.
It is. The Turkish parliament, despite huge pressure from Washington, listened to its people and refused to let the U.S. stage the invasion from their territory. And for this democratic act, they were met with instant anger and punishment from Washington.
It makes it clear that this second superpower, public opinion, is seen by the leadership class as a dangerous obstacle to be managed or just ignored. Okay, so we've laid out the doctrine and the ideology. Now let's get into the system's mapping. If policies aren't driven by democratic will, we have to look at this specialized class making the decisions and the institutional logic guiding them.
Right. When we analyze who the responsible men are, the book argues they get that status not because of talent, but because they subordinate themselves to the existing systems of power. And policy flows from a framework where economic power is heavily centralized.
So politics is really just a reflection of concentrated economic power.
The philosopher John Dewey put it perfectly. He said politics is simply the shadow cast on society by big business. Since the U.S. system allows economic power to be concentrated in these huge, private, unaccountable tyrannies, state policy just naturally gears itself to serving them.
And that logic goes way back, doesn't it? Even to the founding of the country.
It does. Chomsky brings up James Madison, who understood that a primary goal of government had to be to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. The whole institutional design is structured to protect elite decision-making and marginalize the public.
So 21st century imperial strategy is just a modern expression of that same enduring concern, protecting concentrated private interests on a global scale.
It's the logical extension. The systems of state power are, at their core, serving the interests of concentrated economic power. And if those interests demand global dominance, then policy will reflect that, no matter the risk to everyone else.
So let's focus on the incentives that drive this strategy, even when it's so destabilizing. What are the enduring missions?
They've been remarkably consistent since World War II. You can break them down into three main objectives. First, control of the world's critical energy supplies, mostly Middle Eastern oil.
That's eight.
Second, containing other potential power centers, Europe, Japan, and now, of course, China and Russia, and keeping them within the U.S.-managed global order.
And the third one is maybe the most revealing. Preventing independent nationalism, which Chomsky calls the virus infecting others.
That virus is so key to understanding this. It's the fear that a country might successfully develop on its own terms, managing its own resources for its own people.
Because that success might be a dangerous example to others.
Exactly. If a small, poor country pulls itself up without submitting to the U.S. economic model, that example might spread, and that would reduce the opportunities for U.S. capital. So containment isn't just about geopolitical rivals, it's about containing successful economic models.
So even something like the European social market system could be seen as a threat.
Absolutely, because popular programs like universal health care or strong worker protections could have a dangerous ideological effect on the American public. If you see a successful alternative, you might start demanding similar reforms at home.
So the imperial strategy is also a defensive one, meant to protect against ideas that might influence the domestic enemy territory, the American public itself.
It's about overcoming these crises of democracy at home and abroad. It's an internal ideological defense as much as it is an external strategy.
Okay, so if the system's logic demands this kind of dominance and it requires unpopular policies, then the public, the bewildered herd, has to be managed. This gets us to the manufacture of consent.
This is the critical mechanism. The term comes from Walter Lippmann, a leading liberal intellectual who saw this firsthand during World War I, working on propaganda committees. He saw it as a self-conscious art and regular organ of popular government.
It's a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
We think of propaganda as a tool of authoritarian states, but the argument here is that it's even more necessary in free societies.
That's the core of it. In a totalitarian state, you can use force. In a democracy where the state can't do that, you have to replace coercion with sophisticated psychological control. That's why the modern institutions of thought control really originated in the most free societies, like Britain and the U.S.
And this isn't just about messaging to foreign enemies.
No. The Reagan administration's Office of Public Diplomacy is a perfect example. A high-ranking official openly described its mission as a huge psychological operation of the kind the military conducts to influence a population in denied or enemy territory.
They're talking about the American public as enemy territory.
The phrasing is incredibly revealing, and the propaganda campaign leading up to the Iraq War is the modern case study. It was a brilliant success.
How so?
The campaign successfully linked Saddam Hussein to 9/11 and the threat of terrorism, even though there was no connection. This deliberately shifted U.S. public opinion off the global spectrum in terms of support for the war. It achieved its political goals by making people afraid, allowing the institutional logic to just roll forward.
So we have a system driven by private interests, justified by a noble ideology and managed through manufactured consent. And this whole thing persists by creating these dangerous feedback loops that just escalate global risk.
Right, and the most dangerous loop is the one that feeds WMD proliferation. Chomsky points out that an aggressive imperial posture, especially the doctrine of preventative war, creates overwhelming incentives for any state that feels threatened to get WMDs.
Because it's the only credible deterrent against arbitrary aggression from the global hegemon.
It's the only one. Strategic analysts openly admit that targeted states know that the United States can be held at bay only by deterrence.
And the comparison between Iraq and North Korea illustrates this perfectly.
It does. North Korea was and is a far more brutal regime than Saddam's Iraq, but it wasn't attacked because it had a credible deterrent. It could hurt South Korea and Japan. Washington was basically teaching the world an ugly lesson. If you want to be safe from us, you better act like North Korea.
And Washington reinforces this instability by actively dismantling international security agreements.
Yes, by blocking UN efforts to ban the militarization of space or biological weapons, the U.S. accelerates this proliferation cycle. This then justifies more aggressive U.S. military spending and the drive for full-spectrum dominance. It's a self-perpetuating, catastrophic loop.
Let's shift now to the present day. How do these doctrines from the early 2000s continue to shape conflict patterns today?
Well, the core argument holds. The doctrine of preventive war just inherently breeds instability. It institutionalizes the rule of force over the rule of law.
And the sources in the book warned about this, saying the plans for extended confrontation, not political accommodation, carried huge risks.
Yes, the disregard for international law threatens to leave the world more dangerous and divided, and the United States less secure. This pattern of intimidation leads smaller states and non-state actors to look for cheap and easy ways of exploiting U.S. vulnerabilities.
It all comes from this deep resentment of perceived intimidation.
And this takes us back to the roots of the system. Adam Smith himself condemned the merchants and manufacturers in England who were the principal architects of policy, making sure their own interests were taken care of no matter the effect on others. This isn't a new phenomenon, it's just operating on a global scale now.
Now let's look again at those existential threats, nuclear and environmental, which the system treats as secondary. The current military buildup seems to follow a similar logic of escalating risk.
The commitment to ballistic missile defense, or BMD, and the weaponization of space is incredibly destabilizing. U.S. strategic analysts don't even call BMD a shield. They call it an enabler of U.S. action.
So it's not a defensive tool, it's an offensive one. It lets you attack without fear of retaliation.
Precisely. One analyst said BMD gives the U.S. absolute freedom in using or threatening to use force, and rivals like China and Russia correctly see this as an offensive move. It forces them to expand their own arsenals, which increases global instability.
And the environmental threat is treated with the same systemic contempt.
The book documents the Bush administration's contemptuous pass on the global warming problem. The decision-making prioritized narrow sectors of private power fossil fuel companies over severe, recognized threats to the environment. It shows the ideology is just incapable of valuing long-term survival when it conflicts with short-term profit.
The net effect of all this is the systematic erosion of international norms. The national security strategy basically throws out the international rule of law and the UN Charter.
The American Academy of Arts and Sciences noted that the primacy of law over force, which had been a major thread in U.S. foreign policy since WWII, just disappears from the new strategy. Force reigns supreme.
And this isn't an anomaly of one administration. The record of U.S. vetoes at the UN Security Council shows a consistent pattern.
Yes, since the 1960s, the U.S. has been far and away the leader in vetoing Security Council resolutions, often alone, even on resolutions just calling on states to observe international law. When the UN doesn't serve as an instrument of American unilateralism, the system just dismisses it.
And this erosion of international law is mirrored by an erosion of domestic law.
The post-9/11 claims of executive authority were a dangerous extension of this logic. The administration claimed the right to declare anyone, including U.S. citizens, an enemy combatant, and imprison them indefinitely without charge or access to a lawyer.
Which brings to mind that powerful warning from Winston Churchill.
Churchill warned that the power of the executive to imprison someone without charge is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian government. The powers claimed by the administration reflected the same underlying logic. When law gets in the way of power, power asserts its dominance, whether the target is a foreign country or a domestic citizen.
So this deep dive really situates the pursuit of hegemony within these broader themes of power versus survival. And the most stark theme is how a path towards self-destruction can appear to be rational.
The book suggests the system's choice of hegemony over survival isn't random. It's rational, but only within its own doctrinal framework. The institutional structure, rooted in market fundamentalism, rationally chooses the option that maximizes immediate power and wealth for the few.
And a crucial part of that calculation is just systematically devaluing the future.
That's the chilling part. In the framework of neoclassical markets, the interests of future generations, people with no political voice, no dollar votes, are valued at zero.
So if an action destroys the environment but maximizes immediate profit, the system will prioritize that action.
Precisely. Chomsky argues it's therefore rational to destroy the possibility for decent survival for our grandchildren if doing so maximizes immediate wealth. This isn't a new pattern in history, but with nuclear and environmental risks, the stakes are now species survival.
And we've talked about how the ideology of altruism and elevated ideals masks all of this structural violence.
That mask is essential. The idea of the U.S. as the historical vanguard reframes acts of aggression as missions of righteousness.
And if you challenge that by pointing to the actual consequences, you get labeled.
You're labeled anti-American, which is a term straight out of the totalitarian lexicon, like anti-Sovietism. It ensures that any criticism of the state is seen as a criticism of the nation itself. It's a mechanism to insulate policy from any real scrutiny.
So we have the emergence of the second superpower, world public opinion, but institutional power works hard to keep the public constrained, especially at home.
Right. The crisis of democracy is when the public gets involved. The solution has been population discipline through thought control, media management, and neoliberal policies designed to shrink the public arena.
Which creates a democratic deficit.
Yes. What's left of democracy becomes the right to choose between consumer goods, while the fundamental decisions are left to private tyrannies and the specialized class. Business leaders have long talked about the need to impose a philosophy of futility on people, to get them to focus on superficial things.
So keeping the public as spectators is necessary to prevent them from managing their own affairs, because that would challenge the whole system.
That's the function of the bewildered herd concept. But the book also points to a counter trajectory, the rise of international solidarity movements, like the World Social Forum. This represents the organizational form of that second superpower, dedicated to the idea that another world is possible.
So this deep dive into hegemony or survival gives us a new way to see global power. It suggests that the 2002 National Security Strategy wasn't an aberration, but just an open declaration of enduring policy goals.
It forces us to see the institutional priority placed on maintaining power and economic control over international law, over global stability, and even over the security of the U.S. population itself. The system is designed for dominance, even at the cost of safety.
The conclusion is pretty stark then. The present moment is one of especially grave danger. The patterns we've analyzed show history following two opposing trajectories.
One trajectory leads toward hegemony, acting rationally within a lunatic doctrinal framework as it threatens survival. And the other is that emerging trajectory of global public opinion and solidarity movements, which are challenging that framework.
It brings us back to that terrifying opening question. Are humans a biological error? Bertrand Russell once said that after ages of harmless life, evolution produced Neros and Hitlers, but he hoped it was a passing nightmare.
And the crucial question, borrowing from Chomsky's end thoughts, is whether we can awaken ourselves from this nightmare of prioritizing dominance. Will the momentum of that second superpower be sustained and strong enough to force the institutional shift we need to choose survival? That choice, the book argues, rests with us.
The deep dive explored the institutional logic of global power structures outlined in Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance by Noam Chomsky.
We encourage you to read the book yourselves, support the author if you found the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.